Debbie, you need to make sure the sound is off on the audio. Thank you.
Why is that still happening? Has it stopped? If I mute, no, it's just wondering if I mute it the other way.
Try it. Hello, welcome to Edgware and Hendon Reformed Synagogue's Talk of the Week for Friday. We're just sorting out some sound problems at the moment.
Is that any better?
No, it's not.
How can
Okay, just maybe I have to turn the other one off, but you know you can come in on it.
Yeah.
Sorry about all these technical difficulties. We will get there. Lovely. Very good to welcome you to our EHRS Talk of the Week with Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers, who you're about to see in a moment from now. Debbie has joined us as our rabbi at EHRS, Edgware and Hendon Reformed Synagogue, and she joined just last Thursday. She's been very busy over this week. I am not, though it may appear so, in Jerusalem, actually. I am still in Finchley, but I do love this background for these Talks of the Week. This is the Blaustein Hall of the Hebrew Union College, or the World Union of Progressive Judaism in Jerusalem. It actually was in no man's land, by the way, which is how the progressive movements managed to get hold of it up till 1967. But luckily, we now have this wonderful piece of real estate that means that when you have a service at the World Union for Progressive Judaism, you can see into the old city of Jerusalem. It's really very special. So, Debbie's going to be speaking about the Bible and social distancing, Jewish values in the face of COVID-19. If you haven't already, please now go to the EHRS website, scroll down to where it says Online Talk of the Week, and if you do that, you will find Debbie's texts that she's going to share with us. But we're also going to try an experiment of sharing them on screen so you'll be able to see them here. Should work, I hope. So hopefully everything technically will work, and I'm going to bring Debbie forwards so that we can see her just now. So Debbie, over to you, please.
Hello, it's lovely to finally be here. It's odd to not be with everyone, but nice to also be with everyone in whatever way that we can manage. And I'm looking forward to when we can physically all learn and pray and be together. If those of you who haven't met me before and weren't around 10, 11 years ago when I was a student rabbi at EDRS, if you were a Hendon member or just weren't around then, in fact, even if you were around then, we may not have discussed my rabbinic thesis, which was very odd and specialized, and people's response to it at the time was, how on earth are you going to use that in a progressive context? And today is an excellent example of how I've managed to. My thesis was on what women have done with the laws of nida, of menstrual purity, over the course of Jewish history. And over the last decade, I've done lots and lots of teaching about those laws, about the use of mikvah, and it's really one of those things that I'm very passionate about, more the mikvah side of things. And last November, I had the pleasure of going to a Mikvah Conference in Atlanta, where I was able to teach a session to basically the America's leading mikvah activists who are creating incredible cross-communal mikvahot around the country, which we're trying to do here in the UK now. They asked me to teach a session on feminist understandings of nida. So it's an area that I'm really excited by, and I really have been struck by how a lot of those ideas and texts can speak to us for now, both because as modern Jews, we read back into the Torah and we find new meaning and reinvent meaning and layer onto it, but also because I really believe that a lot of the laws that we find slightly uncomfortable and body focused and a bit unkind, maybe a bit icky, a lot of those things were intended as biblical public health policy. Not all of them by any stretch, but a lot of them, if we look at what they're doing, they are trying to say, if you are ill and have some disease that could be spread amongst the masses who would have gathered at the temple, please don't do that when you're not very well. We don't really want you hanging out with everybody. I think the fact that the biblical mindset understood that in terms of contagion is actually quite impressive. We didn't have a modern understanding of germs and the importance of hand washing and all those sorts of things. That didn't start till about 200 years ago. I mean, really very recent. And in fact, women died en masse in childbirth, not because of childbirth, but because doctors weren't washing their hands between being in a sick ward and then going into a labour ward. So it's actually kind of incredible that these ideas already exist in Torah. And then we're going to work through a little bit through Jewish history to look at some of the values that I think we have found really challenging to live in this time, and what we're doing about it. So I'm going to try and share my screen.
Debbie, just before you do that, I'd just like to say something to you. First of all, to everybody who is here, any question that you have got, it's not going to work, it's going to disappear, but any question you have of Rabbi Debbie, email it to me, rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk, and perhaps Debbie will say that once in a while through her talk, and I'll be able to pose it to Debbie when she's finished her teaching us, rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. And the second thing is, that often happens on the stream is you think, is anybody listening? Well, just to let you know, you've got 41 screens on you, so you've probably got close to 100 people. So enjoy yourself.
All right. So, and Rabbi Mark, do interrupt if you have a question or if something comes in that you think we could answer in the moment.
That, okay.
Very happy to be interactive. Okay. Let's try and share. I've now got a different option for what I can share, but hopefully you can all see. Has it worked, Rabbi Mark? Can we see what we need to see? Great. So this first passage is actually straight out of last week's Torah portion. And I mentioned a little bit of it in my Devar Torah last Friday. This is talking about tzara'at, which was some kind of white, flaky skin disease. It's often translated in the Hebrew as leprosy, but it really doesn't seem like it was leprosy. It was some flaky skin problem. And they, I believe, thought that these things were contagious, could be caught one from the other, and wanted to protect the community. So I've started halfway through verse 45 where it says, he shall call out, that's the person who's sick, unclean, unclean. So the person who is sick has to declare it publicly. It's not just that you quietly take yourself off and go and sit in isolation for a week, but you really have to let people know about it. Maybe because you're warning people who have been in contact with you that you've got it, but also to really publicly show, and we'll look at how Rashi reads that very shortly. And the person, the verse carries on talking about that person. He shall be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So social isolation in the biblical context isn't about staying in your tent, because we have to remember this is a settlement of 600,000 people all camping together. Privacy was probably quite a big issue. In fact, one of my favorite midrashim talks about why the blessing that Bilam offers to the gathered Israelites is Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. How great are your tents, Jacob? Why are they great? According to the Midrash, because they were put up so that each tent preserved some kind of familial privacy and the entrances never met each other. That said, they are still living cheek by jowl. So if you are sick, even though you might have familial privacy, you want to protect your family, but you also want to protect your neighbors. So you're taken out of the camp to dwell apart. And the a sort of offshoot of this is you don't return not only once you're free of the disease, but 7 days after that. And that is true if you have all sorts of different ailments, including venereal disease, which comes up a lot in the discussions around bodily purity stuff. It's really about, I believe, separating these people away from the community to protect the community. It's biblical responsible living and social distancing. So this guy, according to Rashi, who is commenting on that verse just below, says, he shall call out, unclean, unclean. He must proclaim aloud that he is unclean, so that people may keep away from him. Today we can put a mask on, we just know to keep away from everybody because we don't know who is unclean. In the case of someone with Sarat, you might be able to see it, you might not. But it's quite interesting that there is this need for public warning about the information. And this is one instance of quite a few where I think we're looking at biblical health policy. When it comes to venereal disease, which is discussed alongside natural bodily emissions that we expect, like nida, like menstruation, we've got this idea in Leviticus 15. If we look at Leviticus 15 in its entirety, I think it's a fabulous bit of Torah, because we often think of things around bodily purity as being focused on women and women's issues, literally. But it's really not. It's very, very even-handed. It discusses two different kinds of men, one who is having a healthy, normal emission and one who is having an unhealthy emission. And then it discusses two kinds of women, the same pattern, an unhealthy and then a healthy emission. And they are treated differently. We know that if you are ill, you are isolated for 7 days after you are better. Whereas in the case of a woman who's having a completely normal emission, it's only the 7 days total. Sorry, 7 days total. And if you want to look at the rabbinic reasons that those things got mushed together later, that's another session for another time. But what's interesting here is there is an understanding of illness transference in Leviticus 15. If someone is sick, this isn't for someone who is having a normal, healthy emission. This is for someone who is unwell, dava. So if one with a discharge spits on one who is clean, the latter shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. So there's a sense that you, by being in social contact, in physical contact, have to somehow cleanse yourself if you've come into contact with that possible infection. So maybe a bit of alcoholic hand gel in our modern context. If you've gone out shopping and had touched anything, then you get home and you put your hand gel on. And then you yourself are also quarantined to a small extent to keep away from possibly passing on the infection. If one with a discharge without having rinsed his hands in water touches another person, that person shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. An earthen vessel that one with a discharge touches shall be broken, and any wooden implement shall be rinsed with water. When one with a discharge becomes clean of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in fresh water. Then he shall be clean. So why earthen vessels and wooden implements? They are cooking utensils that absorb. They're not glazed like glass. They don't repel flavor. They can absorb the illness potentially. And again, we've had all these discussions about what surfaces are safe for us to touch. Is it safe for us to touch our shopping without wiping it down? Is it safe for us to play in the playground if other kids have been playing there and touching things and coughing on them? It's a very similar social consciousness of awareness that if someone is ill, they can contaminate other things. Now, obviously, the biblical understanding of illness is different to ours. Yes, Mark.
I just want to say something. One of the things for Debbie to be aware of is that she's kept all the 40 screens. It keeps growing, actually. We're up to 42 now, so it's lovely. That Debbie, you can't be seen while the screen can be seen. So see Debbie doing all these wonderful hand gestures.
It'll probably still happen.
Helpful for you to know that while your screen's being shared, we can't see you. Not that that matters, because the texts are really important. The other thing I want to say to people,
and maybe occasionally I'll stop sharing and say hello.
The other thing I want to say to people is please feel welcome to send any questions or any issues, one's already come, to me that can be put even during the talk. If it's something that's about an issue that Debbie's bringing up, you're not quite clear what she said or how one thing linked to another, feel welcome to send an email. I'm monitoring them all the way through, and I can give her a big wave and then put that question on your behalf. Thank you. I'm disappearing again. rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. And Rochelle, I'm really happy that you managed to get back into this.
Thank you, Rabbi Mark. Okay, so if you've joined us and you missed it from the start, we've got, just to recap, in Leviticus 13, we've got this idea that someone has to declare themselves publicly unclean, so it's been heard and they're avoided. And as long as you are unclean, you dwell away from everybody else. Not only do you not go to temple, do you not mix with people outside your family, you separate yourself off even from your family. And you declare your uncleanness so that it can be heard publicly. But then in Leviticus 15, we've also got this idea that there's a transference of possible contamination through spit, through touch, very much a sense, as we have today, that we might need to respond when we've been in contact with something that could be dangerous. So I am going to stop sharing for a moment and say hello to everyone. Were there any questions that you received just on that lot, Rabbi Mark, before we move on? Okay. So for me, I think there's something, we can argue that I'm looking at the Torah with modern eyes and reading it back, which is what we do all the time because we are who we are and we can only read Torah with who we are. But at the same time, I really think that having read these texts over the last decade over and over, it's very clear to me that the Torah is trying to protect our health. And in fact, as Rabbi Emily said in Shabbat B'Bayit last week in her Devar Torah, it's really a sense of the Torah's acknowledgement that it doesn't shy away from our reality as physical beings. Yes, we are spiritual creatures, but actually we live a reality in physical form. And the Torah is going to talk about the icky stuff and the real stuff. It's not going to pretend that everything is spirit and beauty. Yes, Rabbi Mark.
Well, this I think is a time to put a question that's come in from Jill and Robert Bernard, which takes what you were just saying a little bit further. And they ask, is the isolation a ritual for health? Is it just a ritual? Is it, something we do? Is it for health? It seems to be clearly ritual. They quote one particular verse in Leviticus where Aaron and his sons have to stay at the tent of meeting for 7 days. It's a ritual. That's it. Yeah. And yes, they would appear to be isolated, but that's nothing to do with health, is it? They say we can't remember this ever being said when they talk about this leprosy or whatever it might have been, ever being linked to limiting contagion. It doesn't seem to say that. So aren't we putting a modern scientific interpretation on a text that was intended to be purely spiritual? So that's from Jill and Robert.
Brilliant. So I think we, of course, are reading it as modern rational readers because that's who we are and that's what we do. But I don't personally think this is the social public health stuff wasn't intended. I do believe it was intended to be a physical way to protect a community that we're living very close together. I do think it demonstrates an understanding of the spread of contagion. I don't know lots of sources that discuss it like that, but actually Rashi does. Rashi is saying that you do this so that people may keep away from him, not so that you you have a spiritual experience whilst your skin is shedding. I agree that there are definitely examples of social isolation that are spiritual, and I would actually argue that there are spiritual elements to the social isolation suggested for men and women who've had natural bodily emissions. But I think there is also, for me, very clearly a public health policy that's going on. And as I was saying at the beginning, I think there's an astonishing understanding of how we protect one another from contagion. We didn't understand a lot of the stuff about germs and dirt and passing on ichs until a couple of hundred years ago medically. So it's quite astonishing to find it in an ancient text, because it does involve washing and cleansing. I think this is probably a little apocryphal, but when I was at university, there was an amazing chaplain called Malcolm Wiseman, who used to travel all over the country talking to particularly small, isolated university groups. And I was in one of those in Lancaster, where there were about 10 Jews. And Malcolm, I remember, talked at one point about how Jews had been protected from the worst excesses of the Black Death because they were so connected to hand washing. They so much more regularly washed their hands before eating than the general population. I think it's probably a little bit apocryphal as to the extent that hand washing saved the Jews. And of course, Jews did die of the Black Death, but arguably maybe did it in fewer numbers, which is why they were blamed for it. But interestingly, that leads me onto the flip side of that, which is I think there are things for us as Jews today that have meant we have suffered more with this current contagion than perhaps we did in previous ones when the hand washing helped us. Purim was particularly badly timed, one could argue, and we all came together for Purim. But we've seen in lots of parts of the Jewish community, groups still meeting, people going to each other's for Seder meals, weddings happening and being reported in the Daily Mail. We do find as a community, social isolation is not generally overall is not our natural inclination. Of course, there are individual exceptions to that, but it's not often how Jewish life works. And so that's the next part of this conversation. So let's go back to screen sharing. If we look at Pirkei Avot, which is from the Mishnah, so we've jumped from the biblical period to around about, it was collated around about 200 CE. So we're into the last couple of millennia. And Hillel said, "Do not separate yourself from the community." And I think that's such a simple way of expressing how we have a sense of draw to be together, and that there is somehow a dismissal of someone who might set themselves aside and do things a bit differently, and we do want to be together. And that's expressed again by Maimonides, by Rambam, who looks at the rabbinic precept of what it means to love your neighbor, which I think is in this week's parasha. It's in lots of parashiyot. It's one of the most important things that we have, mitzvot that we're given. And interestingly, I don't know about all of you, in terms of social distancing, one of the responses that where I live we've had is I've actually come to know my neighbours in a way that I never did before this crisis. So although we're told to love our neighbour today, very often we don't really know a lot of our neighbours. So we've now come to know each other as neighbours, which is wonderful. But the way that we love our neighbour, according to Rambam, is, he says, it is a rabbinic positive precept to visit the sick, comfort the mourners, escort the dead, dower the bride, accompany the departing guests, as well as to cheer the bride and groom and to assist them in whatever they need. Even though all these precepts are of rabbinic origin, They are implied in the biblical verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is, whatever you would have others do to you, do to your brothers in Torah and precepts. And I'm going to assume that that also includes sisters. That we're also allowed to be loving neighbors and to be loved. So really, we have focused in rabbinic tradition on all these incredible things that as communities we're often really good at. You know, we do tend to visit the sick, to comfort the mourners. Those are the things that are part of being in a community that right now we're having to say, but we can't. Or how can we? And we're trying to find new ways to think about how we visit the sick, how we comfort the mourners. Rabbis Emily and Mark have held the most incredible amount of grief and mourning over the last month. I've only just begun to dip my toe into how we do that electronically. And interestingly, my first experience of it this week is that actually it was quite an intimate thing to be able to do. To have the camera right in front of you means you can really interact and be present with the mourners in a way that actually I hadn't really experienced before. So although we're being told to follow these biblical ideas of protecting one another, we want to visit the sick, we want to comfort the mourners, we have to find new ways to do that. Our rabbinic impulse still allows us to do that. As a community, we can still engage in loving our neighbor, but one of the ways that we need to love our neighbor is to protect them from the spread of COVID-19, and listen to how we hold in balance both the biblical assertion of public health protection alongside the Rambam's ideas of how we show ourselves to be good neighbors. And actually all of these have different ways that we could read them and play with them. You know, we're supposed to cheer the bride and groom. So many weddings are being delayed. And I was part on Monday of a friend's hen night. She was supposed to have a hen do last weekend. Her wedding in May is not happening in May now, but we wanted to cheer them up. We wanted to show them that we can still celebrate with them. So we had a mini online hen night with tiaras and cocktails. And, we tried to find a way to cheer, to hold, to love. Even if it's not what originally would have been planned. And it's actually such an interesting way to think about how we love our neighbor. Loving our neighbor now is about both the positive and also about protecting one another. So as we move down to Talmud Yoma, we start to understand why it's important to balance both the loving our neighbor and social distancing. So Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh said, and the children of Israel shall keep Shabbat. That's Exodus 31 in a few weeks' time. Sorry, a few weeks ago. The Torah said, desecrate one Shabbat on his behalf, so he will observe many Shabbatot. The idea there being, if someone is going to lose their ability to keep Shabbat, in other words, they're going to die on Shabbat, you break Shabbat to save them. And it goes on. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, if I would have been there among those sages who debated this question, how many of us have said that? I would have said that my proof is preferable to theirs, as it states, you shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do and live by them, and not that he should die by them. In all circumstances, one must take care not to die as a result of fulfilling the mitzvot. Yes, Rabbi Mark.
What I just want to say to people as we're going through this, there may be things where you're thinking, I'm not sure about what Debbie's saying, what Rabbi Debbie's saying, and I'd like to put a different view. And please feel welcome to do that. Just all the HRS rabbis are up for questioning, argument, discussion, and Debbie's very much part of the team in that way. So please feel that if anything that Debbie's saying, think, no, I don't agree with that, that's also fine. Again, just send it through to rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Mark. You can all be Shmuel and bring better proofs than mine, preferable proofs, which he does. And I just to affirm what Rabbi Mark has said, I love the Jewish tradition of discussion and debate and disagreement. I think it is one of our greatest gifts, and we see it so beautifully in Yoma 85b here, that they've given an example that proves the point and says it well enough, and Shmuel says, yeah, but argue it this way. This is much more compelling and convincing. And I think Shmuel's probably right. It is a much more compelling argument. You should live by them and not die by them. You live by the law. You don't die by the law. And I think that's really, really important. Our Judaism is here to allow us to live well. If that means adapting things, breaking things, doing things differently, that's what we do. Judaism has always been dynamic, has always changed, has always grown, and has always responded to the reality that it finds itself in. And we've got so many ways that we've been doing that as a community. It's sort of astounding to understand how you begin a job in the middle of all of this. There are so many ways that we've been able to connect. The services have continued. We are really clear that whatever we do as a community, it is to help us live as well as we can. And that includes the funerals and having funerals where, heartbreakingly, it is, the rabbis and the deceased and our mourners online, that is so that we can live by them. That is so that we can all go on to live as well as we can, and not create bigger problems than the ones we are already facing. So I think these texts are really, really real and relevant. So as it says just below, actually, I didn't realize I'd put this one in. For someone who has a dangerous illness, it is a commandment to break Shabbat for him. One who hurries to do this is praised. One who asks about this is a murderer. So we don't question the idea that you break mitzvot, you break laws in order to save life. Pikuach nefesh. We save human life as a really important Jewish principle. And actually, to even question the idea that Pikuach Nefesh is the overarching principle, if you are going to think twice about it, you're basically a murderer, which is very, very strong and very powerful, right? By everything we do at the moment, we have to consider others and we have to consider the impact that our actions might have. Before we turn over to all of you and your questions, I want to close with a beautiful little piece of Martin Buber, who is an amazing Jewish thinker. And I discovered this text when I was looking for something else, and it just struck me as being so resonant to where we are right now today. Buber wrote, "When two people relate to each other authentically and humanly, God is the electricity that surges between them." I think that idea of human connection is so powerful, and I, for one, am definitely missing it. I'm sure lots of others might be too. That idea that when we meet each other face to face and are with each other, there's an electricity that surges between us. And now this isn't at all what Buber can have intended, but how brilliant that now it is electricity surging between us that allows us to relate, to connect, to be together humanly and authentically. And it's a sort of an astonishing development of that idea that, maybe there's a great song by Billy Jonas, who was a regular at Limud a number of years ago, where he talks about God being in everything. God is in your Tupperware, but not in the lids, so by extra, and all sorts of other places that God can be found. Perhaps Billy Jonas style, God is in the Ethernet and the cables and the electricity that is bringing us all together in these new and incredible ways. I think even once we begin to reconnect physically, we're going to see that it happens probably in stages, that we're not all together all at once, and we may well have been changed in how we interact. But finding our ways, whether electronically or face-to-face, to relate authentically and humanly so that God is present and surging between us, is our constant goal and opportunity in coming together as community. So I really do believe that the Torah has fantastic examples of how important social distancing is, and that it is medically important. It's public health policy, and we're not the first to experience it by any stretch. And that our Jewish values that drive us to some extent ignore that social distancing today also remind us that there are other ways to do those things, and that we can come together to live by our Judaism and not to die by it.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for getting us started and getting us thinking. Rabbi Debbie, that's great. And I've got some questions. Okay, so here comes one of them. This is really referring to the text a couple of texts ago. This comes from Andy Lucas, who asked this question. Does that mean if you know somebody is going to die imminently, you would then perhaps hold Shabbat on a different day so that you don't lose that opportunity that week?
That's such an interesting question. I think that would really be up to individual decisions for people. If you feel that you've broken your Shabbat to help this person and you really missed it and needed it, there'd be nothing to stop you having Shabbat on another day. I think what might be lost in doing that is you would essentially be doing it on your own. The parallel that jumps into my mind is actually a lot of Muslim women skip fast days during Ramadan, which we're now in, if they are sick or menstruating, men and women, if they're sick, that you're allowed to skip a day of fasting and you make it up later in the year. And a lot of my Muslim friends say they make it up in December when the days are shorter. But they do say that there's a loss to fasting on your own when it's not with the entire community. And I think Shabbat, for me, it would feel similarly. If I'm doing Shabbat on a Tuesday and no one else is, it might be nice to have a day off and to recuperate, but I'm not sure if it would feel like Shabbat. I think it's also important to say, Andy, that if you break Shabbat to save a human life, you're not breaking Shabbat. You're doing what needs to be done. It's within halakha. And I think Shabbat is still Shabbat. It's not broken, whatever that might mean, because that means different things to different people. So I, as with all things, I think it would be your personal need, but you haven't lost Shabbat.
Thank you, Rabbi Debbie. That's lovely. Now I have another question from Kay Bagon. And before I ask the question, I want to just put to everybody who's watching, and there must be at least 80 of you, I think, a suggestion that Kay had this morning. I'll just mention it now and just leave it there. Kay made a suggestion. How about us thinking about creating a book of Rabbi Neal's recipes, his crafty cookery corner that used to be in Emet and then in Lador Vador, as a memento for us all to have possibly. So Kay came up with this idea. Been discussing it a bit this morning with Bonnie, who'd be the person probably in the end responsible for making it work. If we were into it, somebody would need to volunteer to get the recipes out of Emet, which is not on any computer files, I'm afraid. So they would need retyping and things like that. But all the Lador Vador ones are very easy to pick up. But if somebody thought that's a great project to get involved in, it might be post-coronavirus, because you'd actually have to get up into our archive. But it does sound like a rather fun idea. So if anyone's into that, please contact me, rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. Anyway, so the crafty cookery book could be really cool.
Lovely.
Okay, here's Kay's question. How do we reconcile ourselves with the idea that Miriam was smitten with leprosy as a punishment for gossiping? Some rabbis are still saying that coronavirus is a punishment, or a magefah, plague.
The great question. As I said earlier, the biblical understanding of illness, I think, was quite advanced for its time, but it was still an ancient world understanding of illness. So, for example, in Leviticus 15, this isn't the Miriam case, but when we look at the different bodily emissions that men and women have, it's very clear that there are two kinds that are normal and natural, and two kinds where you're sick. And the two kinds where you're sick, you are expected to take a sin offering. So there's clearly an understanding theologically that if you're ill, there is some causality, and that causality has to do with your actions. that is not a theology that has stood the test of time, certainly within progressive and even modern Orthodox Judaism. But I have also heard those claims. A friend of mine received a message from her mum about that in the Haredi world, they're blaming you lot for this because she's gay. How, first of all, it doesn't help anybody. And second of all, I think the Haredi community has been struck really, really badly by this. It's their way of finding meaning in this stuff. And I think we've all done a little bit of that. I've seen lots of narratives around how this is the earth forcing us to take a break and have a rest. I'm not convinced it's the earth forcing us to do that, but I do think there is something about our massive amounts of travel and the way that we consume that have exacerbated what has happened. So there is definitely human action that has caused issues. But the idea that there's a theology that God does this as a punishment is certainly not where we are. For me, it's not a matter of reconciling. It's a matter of saying that's a theology that fitted in a biblical mindset, and it's how our ancestors and the world before us tried to understand these things, and it's just not how we engage with the idea. We have a much better understanding of what causes illness. I think what's interesting to me is that even alongside that theology, there is social distancing. There is an understanding that you might be being punished for this, but you're also contagious. So it's kind of an interesting balance in there. But I think those kind of theologies are abhorrent and shouldn't be a part of progressive Judaism or general theology. But they're there, and they're people's way of struggling in a very scary world to find meaning.
Thank you, Rabbi Debbie. That's great. Now, here's another question, which is about some of the other sources that you mentioned. This is a question I'd like to ask you. So you brought Rashi, you brought Maimonides. What time periods are we talking about? Do they have different medical knowledge to the time of the Bible, the time of the Talmud? How aware is Maimonides of contagion, for example? We so often hear, he was a physician, he was a doctor. Did he have some different ideas about this? And we've got about just 3 or 4 minutes left to get this talk. So if you have a question, send it. rabbi.mark@ehrs.uk. We'd love to hear yours too.
So yeah, I think Rashi's idea of illness and contagion, again, he tried to find meaning and understanding. And when we look at what was going on in that period, the way Rashi writes and a lot of explanation for these things tends to be almost the science of that time was demonology. Rashi put a lot of this stuff down to demons and evil spirits because he's trying to understand why this happens. And actually, he's also, I think, trying to it's not true. There are places where Rashi also says it's about human behavior, particularly in relation to women. Women's behavior is often a result in terrible things happening to them and their babies because women lost lots of children. And Rashi was trying to help them understand why and find meaning. And it's terrible theology. But that's where Rashi was. And yes, I think with Rambam, it's fascinating. He was a physician and often had quite an interesting understanding of medicine. And he was in the Arab world, which at that time was quite a few steps ahead of Europe in terms of its learning and understanding. He was also quite grumpy and thought everyone should do things his way. So he had very clear ideas about how things are done. I don't imagine we would use a lot of his medical advice today because, again, he uses the medicine of the time, which involved things like humors and different forces acting in the body that are hot and cold and different things like that we don't necessarily apply to today in how we approach medicine. But it's always interesting to see how these things grow and develop over time and what approaches they were taking. There is a little stall in the Shuk in Jerusalem, which sells, he's called the Etrog Man, I think, and he sells lots of different drinks, all based around etrog. And one of them is a Rambam recipe. But I have no idea if it actually heals anything or if it's just really exciting to try something that Rambam recommended.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. I'm back again. Yes, so there is also Etrog vodka was a very important part of the HRS life. We're all going to need to find the recipe. My goodness.
I was wondering, does anyone have the recipe? I've heard it's not known.
Susanna's got a few bottles still in the freezer for us to use, I hope, for this year, but we'll see. So we've come to the end of the timing that we'd allocated for this session. So what I want to do, and Debbie, I'll bring you in a moment, is first of all to say thank you so much to Rabbi Debbie. One of the really wonderful things about these online talks of the week is actually, we have 40-something screens, which means, who knows, somewhere between 40 and 80 people or so enjoying this. It's so lovely to be able to study together of a morning. Next week, we have something, again, I think super special. Some of you joined me last week for our Voices Across the Continents with Ukraine, with the community in Odessa, which was really glorious. And we spoke together, we shared a lot, and I know it was very exciting for people to see some of our friends in Odessa and to see how they've grown up, to be honest, especially some of the younger people and the youth leaders. A couple of weeks before, we were linked with Cape Town. Next week, on Thursday, and it has to be at 3:30 because of the time difference, we're going to be with the Congregação Israelita Paulista. And if you're wondering what language is that, that's Portuguese, because they are in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And they're dealing with a difficult situation where their president doesn't believe this COVID thing really matters. And how on earth do they deal with that as a community? This congregation, by the way, is a Reformed congregation on the conservative side in Sao Paulo. It's Rabbi Michael Schlesinger came to EHRS last year to teach us, and when he was on sabbatical at Leviticus College. That'll be really special. And for this one, you'll be able to see it on live stream, but if you join me on Zoom, and you'll find the link on Our Week Ahead, or just email me, I'll send it to you, then you'll be able to talk with some of his congregants from Sao Paulo, which I think will be a really special opportunity. So that's what we're going to do in our kind of online talk of the week, Voices Across Continent slot for next week. And I know Debbie's got one up her sleeve for the week after, but you'll hear about that once that's organised. Just what's happening next this afternoon, if you want to cheer up in a major way, from 4:15 to 4:45, the Shabbat dinosaurs will be with you for Cuddle Up Shabbat. If you've got anybody small or young who's around you in your life that would like to enjoy that, then please do encourage them to join us. And they can join us on live stream, or again, there was a Zoom link in Our Week Ahead, if they'd like to suggest what to put in a chicken pot, or if they would like to suggest where they have their Shabbat feeling. And very specially this week, the dinosaur who lives here in Finchley, who has been named, thank goodness, as Tirza the T-Rex, is going to meet, was it Dov the
Diplodocus?
Sorry?
Dov the Diplodocus.
Dov the Diplodocus, who is a dinosaur who lives in Bournemouth. So anyway, the thing is, I have been told there's a few people who are considerably over 5 years old who enjoy Cuddle Up Shabbat. It's for anybody who's young at heart as well. Cuddle Up Shabbat is at 6:30, and then Rabbi Emily will be doing Shabbat Lights at 8 o'clock with her family. A lovely way to feel that you're part of a big family on Shabbat evening. And tomorrow morning, we have our regular service at 10:30, including Alfie Wise's Bar Mitzvah. And Rabbi Emily is going to be there to give the sermon and also to give the address to Alfie, which is lovely to be able to join her and to read Torah. And I'll lead the service with her to make sure that all is working very nicely. Meanwhile, to my left, Rabbi Debbie is going to be doing Shabbat Babayit, Shabbat Live. That's on live stream on the EHRS Facebook page. And I know quite a lot of people swap between the two during the time of the service. It's absolutely fine. That's at 11 o'clock. So, Rabbi Debbie, can I just hand back to you for any final words you'd like to say, with many thanks, and just what a delight it is to be able to do this with you.
Thank you all for coming and for having me. And just to say, I've only been here officially for a week, but it's been wonderful to begin to connect with people and to begin loving our neighbours in lots of creative ways. And I'm looking forward to more of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll be attempting to put a recording of this talk on the online Talk of the Week space on the EHRS website in the next couple of days if you felt you missed anything or wanted to see it in more detail. Shabbat Shalom to all of you. And now Debbie and I have to stay here, sitting quietly, for a little while because the live stream needs to catch up with the Zoom. So that's what we do, nice and quiet. But meanwhile, to you, goodbye. And I have a little signal that we've said goodbye, which is I put my glasses on. You'll see that happening in a few moments.
Okay.
And the other thing I do is I also check it on my phone as well.